Hello, we're picking up where we left off last time, and if you recall, we had just gone through the process of working with seed data and running some of these commands here to force some of this content into our database, which we then, of course, tested by running some of these commands here. The next section in our book talks about what they're describing as rich many-to-many associations. So as we saw before, we have these tables that are interconnected with each other, and in order to be able to take kind of, instead of like a kind of an invented table kind of stuck in the middle, here we're actually going to use some of the pre-existing stuff that's already thrown in. So for example, the fact that the articles table has a link to user ID, we're going to leverage that so that we can go basically from table to table. So for example, if you have an article, obviously it has to be connected to at least one user, and then of course if you have comments, comments can have many people attaching to them, and this is really kind of like the whole point here. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to run this Rails command here. So I'm going to get my prompt ready to go. And let's first navigate to the location where our work is located. Which is in the blog folder under projects. And at this point, I'm going to run the Rails command that we see in the book. So the point here is to generate a new model comment. And notice some of the features that we're throwing in here. So first of all, we're going to have an article ID, which is going to be an integer field, a name field that's a string, an email field that's also a string, and some body text. And if you think about, how a comment for an article would be structured, having these fields is pretty logical. You might have more, but don't forget some of the time stamping happens automatically with this. So we'll let this do some of the work. And as you scroll to the next page here, you can see the items that should be created. Once again, we'll notice that we have a migration file that's created, so this isn't built into the database until we actually run the migration, and that's why you see this next command right here is the rake db migrate command. That will go ahead and build out this component in our database. So let's go ahead and let that run, and you can see it did create a table. And if you're so inclined, you can go into your SQLite browser if you wish and explore that. Right now, I'm going to jump to my hard drive here, and I'm going to find the file that they're pointing out, which is app models comment RB, which is the Ruby file that we just created. And let's make sure that we have the right stuff in there. So app models and then comment, and then I'm going to open that up with one of my text editors here. And what we need to add to this, of course, is the fact that comment will belongs to article. So you can't just have a comment hanging in midair. It's got to be attached to an article, so it's got to belong to an article. The next thing that we're going to look at here is the article RB file, because now we also have to have an association between those. So that part of it, so you can see we already have the validation for title and body. We already have belongs to user, has, and belongs to many categories. And now we're just going to add one more little association here, which is has many comments. So we have that piece now added. Go ahead and save that work. Next file that we need to look at is the user file. And this is all based off that little diagram that we saw further up. So that they're just basically following through those steps, if you're wondering. So creating all the links between them. And for the user file here, we already have the has one profile. It has many articles with some ordering already built in. And now we're going to add another line here. So here we're going to say has many. What does it have many? It's going to have many replies. So a comment might have many replies, or an article, if you want to think of it that way. And now we're going to basically put in a little link here to the articles. So through what? Through the articles. The source will come from the comments table. So the symbolic form here of comments. Spelled correctly, of course. Then go ahead and save. Now you should be able to come back to the prompt and run some of these commands to test that everything works. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to put in user equals user dot first. Oh, and of course, what am I doing here? So I'm going to make a couple of points here. First of all, whenever I see that that reload command and you still have your prompt open, great. But what I don't have open is I don't have a Rails console open. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to launch a separate command prompt window, drop back down to the root and back into that project's blog folder. And then from here I'm going to run the Rails console, which is basically the interactive Ruby prompt. The reason I'm doing that is I have my regular prompt sitting there where I can still type commands, and then I have this up and running where I can type my Ruby commands. And in some cases you might find that you're also throwing up a separate prompt just to run the web server. We're not really worried about the web server too much in this chapter. But now we can type this command. So we can do user.first. So you can see that it grabbed the first user, and then it's going to have us type this command, user replies dot empty question mark. So we're checking what's the state of this, and it is empty indeed, because we haven't thrown any comments in. So why would there be any, right? Now let's go ahead and assign article. And I know that having this prompt window on top of that one is a little confusing because it's kind of hard to tell where the window starts and ends. So I'm just going to kind of obscure the other one a little bit. So let's make sure we type that correctly. So here we're going to say article equals user dot articles dot first. All right, now we have that association now that is created. So users articles first. So now we're making a connection. So notice that it shows us that we do have a user ID attached to that particular article. So basically the link is being forged. Now the next command, we're actually going to create comments with that next command. So let's follow this one carefully. So this is basically in lieu of actually running the application on the front end through the browser, and then using that front end to enter the information. We can also force information in this way. And the truth is, you could also manually go into the database using the SQLite browser tool and add information too, just so that you can see that you're, have some data there to work with. Basically, that's really the point of what we're doing here. It's not because we're doing some grand gesture. And I'm following the code here in the book exactly, simply so that I know that I've followed it before, and this will all link up because I think we have a guest in there already, and if not, we'll create them now. And then of course the body of that, can be whatever you want it to be. Hopefully they'd say something better than that, but maybe they would just say that. And then you can go ahead and close that. Go ahead and press enter. And now you are inserting that record in. So now if I type user.replies, we do actually have a link up between those components. And if you want to take that and just type in the size, you can see also that we just have 1, because that's all we've put in at this point. Now if you do want to actually get into the point where you're doing, as they indicate here, advanced finding in the book, and notice how they do an advanced find. They actually use the where keyword, and gee, I wonder where that comes from. Of course your brain should say it comes directly from SQL, and you would be correct. Here we're going to type in this next command, and assuming that I have stuff titled the same, and I might or might not, depending on how good I was about copying this stuff. So we're searching for a very specific string here, and we press enter, and you can see that it did find it because we did create it. So if you wanted, you could also do kind of like a little bit of what they're calling a SQL fragment. So they gave us this example, right? And that's the one we just typed in. There's no reason to type it in again. But the whole point here is in this format, if when they use the double quotes, and you want to try this, please feel free, you're actually switching it from the Ruby syntax over to direct SQL syntax. But you got to be careful here with nesting your single and double quotes. So that's an absolutely possible thing to do. If you want to type that in, go for it. The other thing that you can do is, using that where clause once again, is you can actually directly enter SQL commands as they show here. So what I might suggest is that you do that, but they're putting in dates here, for example, that aren't going to match up with anything you're doing. So you might actually want to look at the dates in your database table before you go ahead and try this, because otherwise you might not find that date. So you can search for anything, so any of the columns that are available for you would be searchable that way. But this is a straight SQL statement, so you can insert those directly, and of course that's the kind of thing that if you're much more comfortable with SQL, you can go ahead and do that. So they have a whole series of examples like that where they're using those SQL statements that are hard-coded, and I would encourage you to try those. I'm not going to demonstrate them here because it's not really changing any of the content in the database, which is really kind of my major concern in this chapter, that we have all the components in place to make the work work. All right. Little bit more examples that way, where they are using some additional SQL keywords, like, and then they're kind of intermingling it a little bit with some of the Ruby syntax. So please experiment with those as well. And then notice that as you keep building these associations, you can also start to chain together a number of commands that kind of like will cross those boundaries as well. They go through some of the other finder methods. These things, of course, are drawn directly from the SQL language, so you're going to see strong correlations to things you've learned with SQL, and that's not by mistake. They want you to know that terminology, and here they keep demonstrating it. And these are all things that indicate how to find things. So I am not typing in all the commands just simply because I'm limited on time here recording this video, but I do want to talk about them so that you are aware. The one thing that we do need to add in here is this concept of scope. Now, I'm going to take a quick pause. Now, what scope brings to the table for us is this ability that if we're doing a certain type of lookup or search or find operation each time. And the example that they give here, let's say that you're always looking at all the categories. The one thing that you would hope is maybe they would be alphabetized, because let's say you have a list of 20 of them, that would make it easier for you to find them. So what you can do is you can actually add a default scope, so that when you do the search on category and you do a category all, then it will bring all those things into the mix automatically in that fashion. So to change that, you can go to App Models Category.rb, and we're in that folder right now, so it should be a piece of cake to get there. And we do want to add the scope in there, so let's just copy that and add a line, paste it in, give it a save. And so we know that they're going to order now by the names of the category by default. That is what's going to happen. If you want to try that out, you can come up here. Now, I didn't type the first command to show you that they're out of order, but let's just assume that it works exactly like that. First of all, the first thing we should do is we should do a reload to reload the memory, clear all the buffers out, and then we're going to type category, capital C, .all, and the listing now of the categories should be alphabetical, where initially programming was first, now event is first. And why? Because event is the first one alphabetically, and so on. So that's just to show you that. The other thing that you can do is you can actually name the scope. So we just did a default scope, which is basically unnamed. It's just the one that's going to automatically happen. But in order to apply these scopes, we're going to go to the article RB file, which should still be open in Notepad++. So there it is. And we're going to add those two lines that we see here. And notice the way that this works here is they're putting in two pieces now, right? So first, the scope would be published. This is if we're searching the article for published. The key takeaway here is basically that these are named scopes. So not only are we, ordering it by a certain search criteria, where you see the where clause here, we are also focusing it on that name. So that way, when we call upon that name, it'll have a predetermined little query that it does. The same thing with draft. Okay, so once you've made that change, make sure you save your work. And then the other change you'll want to make here, and you can see they just keep building up the example, is they're going to add a scope for recent. So we're going to copy that one in. Oop, and that one actually covers two lines here. And paste that one in. The one thing you do want to make sure, though, is that these are on the same line. You might even find it easier if you do this. I think that for me that's easier to read. Finally, they're having us add one more. And this isn't unusual. The reason that they do this is basically to give you a bunch of shortcut commands that you can pull in by name anywhere you want from your code to make this all happen. To try this out, of course, run the reload command and then step through each one of these to pull back those. And notice what they're doing is they're just calling upon article, and they're running each one of the predetermined finds, but now they can do it with one simple command rather than typing out a long cryptic command. So if you know that you're going to be like constantly doing a certain type of search, you can pre-create it and have it called by name, very much like calling in a method, for example. Okay, our next task here is going to be working on adding some custom methods here at the bottom. So working still in the app models article RB file, I want you to notice that they're adding a method called published ? To see if something is published at present. So in other words, is it published at all? So in order to add that, we just can copy the code in the book. We're just going to say def published ? Yes, you can name it with a question mark. I like to put in the end tag right away first, and then come back up and add the middle piece here, which is just going to check to see if published at present, just like so. Go ahead and save that. Back in the comment RB file, we need to make a couple of additions here also, and basically we're going to add this little method here that will check to see kind of exactly what its title says, which to see if it is needing to be published. All right, so let's get the code in first. And this is all on one line. And it's pretty important that you try to keep it on one line if you can. All right, and you can see what they're doing here. So if it's not published yet, and then notice what it's doing is it's calling that other method that we just created to see if it's already there or not. And then in that case, you would go ahead and actually do the publishing. In addition, if you look at the way that this is laid out, and I want you to notice that that all is on one line, and not that it won't work if it's split, but it is really preferred that it is. But notice that there's also a couple of validations that are being thrown in here too, which are these two lines. Let's get those two in. So they have to put their name in, their email, and some sort of a message, and the article has to have been published. Otherwise, you can't make a comment. And if you think about the logic of that, of course, it makes a whole lot of sense. One thing I'm not going to do here is I'm not going to go ahead and run these commands, very simply because they're just checking to see if the stuff that we typed in works. My goal at this point, so you guys know as you're watching this video, is to kind of plow through here as fast as I can and get all the code in, because class is about to start and we're expecting that this is already complete. So those of you that finished the code using older videos, great. If not, it really is the important piece here that you get all this code in place. Now we're going to make additional changes now to this particular comment RB file. You can notice the new method that we're adding in is this one here called after create. So I'm going to add this one in here, and this method is going to be able to be called by name, and notice that this is just going to put a message on the screen, and right now it just says we will notify the author in chapter 9, but you can really put in any message. So after an article is created, or after the comment is created, it will put out this message. So we will notify the author in chapter 9. And of course you could put in any custom message that you wanted in that situation. All right, let's move on to the next little method here, and they're taking basically this example. So instead of like just simply putting text up on the screen, they're actually ramping it up a little bit. So what they're doing in this example is they're actually putting in a little method that will basically do the same thing. So instead of calling it after create, like they did originally, they're going to put in a different method which will kind of build an email to send to the author. And if you think about what that means, if you got a comment on an article, you'd get a little notification. That's really the whole point. So this method here at the bottom is actually going to replace this one. So it kind of seems silly in a sense, but really it's not. It's just showing you a progression here. We're just not stepping through the mechanics of the progression, but we are putting in the different versions. So here we're going to add this method a little farther up here, and then all that's going to do is, symbolically call that method once we call this one. So you see the difference there. So we are just saying after create is basically running this method. This will do that, but notice it will, in the form of a hash, it's actually going to pull up information from our data model, so whichever article and user and email address are attached to it. Make sure you save your work, folks. All right, now we're at the bottom of page 115, and we have to do a couple of little updates here to our models. And you're going to see we have another generate command to run. And what this one is going to do, and interestingly how it's named here, you can see I'm trying to select this, and it's fighting me a little bit. Sometimes these PDFs, I'll tell you. Right, may as well just type it. Right, so Rails generate migration. Remember, this is different than just like generating a model. And the migration name is going to be rename password _to hashed password. And we need to talk about what that is. A hashed password is where you take a password that is in plain text, apply an encryption algorithm to it, usually by using like a predetermined cryptic looking string that would help us run the process, and converting it into something that's cryptic that you wouldn't be able to just look in the database and read somebody's password. And there's different technologies that can be used to do this. I will tell you that this step, for all intents and purposes, really is kind of optional for the kind of thing that we're building, which is more, exploratory and like a demonstration. Whereas if you were building a real application, not only would you want to do this, you'd probably want to use an encryption that's much stronger than the one that we're using here. All right, so once you do this, go ahead and press enter. And what that's going to do is basically generate a migration file for us, which you can see. That's all it did. So now we're going to go to a folder where that is located. So that's the database folder under migrate, and the one that we just added. You should recognize the name, should stand out. And let's go ahead and open that up in our text editor. And we need to make a couple of changes here. So let's adjust the size of the window here just a little bit. And then inside the change method, we're going to add the following. We're going to say rename column. Oops, and that should be an underscore. And we're going to rename users, password, and hashed password. Go ahead and save that work. Now we're going to go ahead and go back to the prompt where we are going to run rake db migrate, which is then going to go ahead and run that migration and make the actual changes to the database, and you can see that there. Now what's not a bad idea to do is to bring up your SQLite browser and just take a real quick look. So first let's attach to the database, so we know that's in the root folder for me under projects, blog, and database. And we are working here with the development database, so go ahead and click open, and then you can click on browse, and then you should be able to go to the users database here, or table, and now I'm not sure that that's the table we want to actually go to. So now I'm looking actually through the different, right, and I think that what's going on here is that we don't actually have this migrated in quite yet. So it seems to be a little bit of a process here. So next thing that we need to do is make some changes to this user RB file. Let's pull that one up, which we know we already have open. And when we get to this little bit of code here, this is one where you want to be a little bit careful. Basically, because I think there's a mistake here, if I remember correctly. So in the core shell, and I'm trying to navigate there now, I think I have a little note at the bottom here, and it's right here where we need to actually change one of the lines of code to read this instead of what it actually reads in the book, because there's a typo in the book. And let's go ahead and add that code in. All right, so the first thing that we're going to see here is the following. So there's a lot of code that needs to be updated in this particular file. So you can see that we have the has one profile, has many articles, has many replies. All that stuff's already in there. But we have quite a bit of additional stuff to add. So let's do that. The first thing that you're going to see that's kind of new here